Hey everyone, it's Eric here. Before kind of getting into the questions, I just want to mention it's a little bit weird to do Q&A in a pre-recorded fashion. So if you have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me. The best place to get me is probably on Instagram or LinkedIn. On Instagram, my handle is Hydroviv_Eric. And then if you search for me on LinkedIn, you should find me. Just look for Eric Roy Hydroviv or something like that. And I also apologize in advance if you can hear my dog walking around. Obviously with COVID, I'm kind of working from a kitchen table here, so it's far from an ideal office situation. So just imagine a dog roaming around. All right, cool. So for the structure of how we'll get through these questions, basically what I've done is I've taken everyone's questions, kind of lumped them into categories, and then sometimes even combine questions just because for the sake of time, there were a lot of similar questions. And the way that we'll do it today is we'll start out there were categories of questions that were very, very specific about very specific chemistry. There was then questions that are specific to me, my career, Hydroviv, and things like that. And then there were a lot of questions just in general, broadly about science, entrepreneurship, activism, and things like that. So if you want to think about the structure of this Q&A, it's starting narrow, and then it's going to get wider. And again, if I didn't answer your question, just reach out over Instagram. That's the best way to get in touch with me. So let's begin. First kind of category of questions has to do with chemistry and water quality. Generally, a lot of people asked about different chemicals or impurities in water, lead, PFAS, chromium-6, microplastics, things like that. Another one, a lot of people are asking, what else should we look out for? Another big one, aside from the lead, chromium-6, PFAS, is arsenic. Now, arsenic is kind of one of those really interesting ones in my mind because it's not something that humans put in the water. It's something that's in the geology itself. So if you draw your water from the ground and the surrounding rocks have arsenic in it, your water's probably going to have arsenic in it. So I think that's another one to talk about. You don't hear a lot of it in the press because you can't really assign blame to someone because it's a naturally occurring element, but it just happens to be very toxic. So that's a big one. Arsenic, I think, especially in California and the Southwest and in the Northeast where I'm from, it's something to really keep an eye on. Of the cities you've created filters for, which metropolitan city is the dirtiest, which is the cleanest? That's a really hard question to ask because dirty and clean are not really scientific things. They're kind of general categories. So what I can say is cities that have a lot of lead in their water right now, for example, Newark, New Jersey's lead is high. Portland, Oregon's water is very high right now with lead. It's actually exceeding the EPA limit. If you're looking at arsenic, those are things, again, in the Southwest and the Northeast generally. Chromium-6, California is really high. PFAS is all over the place. So that's something that wherever we're looking, we're finding PFAS. In terms of what's the cleanest, it's really hard to tell because there's a lot of contaminants that municipalities are not required to test for. So if you're not testing for something, you don't know if they're there. So that can be a little bit of a blind spot. So it's really hard to answer the question, which is the dirtiest, which is the cleanest. Next question was, why do you think there's not more access to clean water when it seems like a doable thing to have clean water for everyone? I guess maybe this could have gone in the policy section of this Q&A, but again, it's a hard question to answer because clean, there's no threshold, what's clean, what's dirty. But what I would say is the way that the regulations are set up in the United States is all of the water that leaves a municipal water treatment facility are required to hit a certain threshold for contaminant concentrations. I would argue that it's not easy or doable to make all of the water leaving a water treatment plant the same standard that I would want to go in my mouth because only a very tiny amount of the water that leaves a municipal water treatment plant is actually consumed. I believe that the water that you use to flush your toilets could be of a different standard than the water that you put in your mouth, but the way the regulations are set up, they're both categorized the same. So the way that I kind of convey this is, what if you had to pay $5 every time you flushed a toilet, right? Like, no one would want that. That doesn't make sense. So it's more of a cost-effective thing. At Hydroviv, the reason why we do what we do with the point-of-use filters is because we can say, okay, let's prioritize the quality of the water that's going in your mouth and worry less about the water that you're using to flush your toilet. That's a personal opinion. Moving on to questions that people asked about my past. So one of the things that people ask a lot about is how I got into water quality and oceanography. It was kind of random. When I went into my undergrad, I thought I wanted to be a doctor. I thought I was going to go to medical school, so I was pre-med. And in taking chemistry, I learned that there was a lot of, I actually found that I was probably better suited for science than medicine because I really enjoyed a variety of things. With water in particular, I had a professor, his name was Whitney King at Colby College, who was an aquatic chemist who was a professor in the chemistry department, even though he had an oceanography PhD. And that was really intriguing to me. I was like, how can you be a chemistry professor but do oceanography? And, in doing so, you learn that there's a lot of different ways to study. And actually, some of the top aquatic chemists on the planet came from oceanography departments. I kind of did a dual PhD, where part of my stuff, the aquatic chemistry side of my PhD came out of an oceanography department. And then the advanced materials side of things came from a chemistry and chemical engineering department, if that makes sense. So I was kind of a little bit of a mutt, if you will. What was the most memorable moment during one of my research cruises? That is a hard question. And of course, I met Julia, your professor, on a research cruise. So I would say, in general, the most memorable things have been the people that you meet along the way. I've been to some pretty crazy places. So I've done research in the Bering Sea, Gulf of Alaska, Antarctica, but the stories that really stick out in your mind are often memorable because of the people that you shared those moments with. And I think that Julia and I have had some really wonderful times on cruises together. And, it's the people that you meet along the way. That's been my experience anyway. Next question was, how did your previous work with Department of Defense feed into the project? Well, with Department of Defense, I had done some water quality stuff for them. We were developing membranes that could selectively remove chemical warfare agents and stuff like that from water, which that type of research is directly applicable to what I'm doing at Hydroviv now. The other thing that I really worked on a lot with the Department of Defense were projects that prevented really bad things from happening. I became an expert on homemade explosives and chemical warfare agents, specifically how to detect and prevent them from inflicting harm on people. So that's something that I spent a lot of time doing with work for the Department of Defense. I was always a civilian, so I never worked for the US government. I worked for companies that developed technology for Department of Defense and firefighters. Next question, what made you realize that you're meant to do this as a career? Was there a specific moment? I don't think there was for me. I just know that I really enjoy working on important problems, and what I've learned is I really like taking laboratory technology and building products from it. A lot of what I found when I was doing a lot of R&D was a lot of the science, the really cool science that I was working on, ended up just getting put on a shelf somewhere, whereas what I've learned is I really like the things that I build getting deployed in the field. So that's, again, a personal preference. Okay, so now we're going to be moving on to Hydroviv and kind of the origin of Hydroviv and that project. A lot of people ask questions generally about how I came up with the idea for water filters, or was it a previous goal to get products in the hands of people in need? The first thing just to convey about Hydroviv, wasn't really supposed to become a company. It was really just a side project. And it kind of grew into a company quite a bit later. So, I mean, I started Hydroviv, I think it was in the end of July 2015, but we didn't really start selling products until quite a bit later. And I didn't hire the first employee until January 2018. So there were a lot of starts and stops because it was a side project. So next question was, how did you reach your first prototype for Hydroviv design-wise? Did you start by modeling the device on existing filters and expand on the abilities, or did you start completely from scratch? I didn't start, that's a good question. So because of my previous experience, I actually knew how to use advanced materials to remove nasty things from water because we had done a lot of those types of things at previous companies. So I was coming from a base level of knowledge that was quite high. So really the initial design and development was to build a prototype and then verify that it actually worked. So that was kind of the early days. So there was no like whiteboard, like, oh my goodness, here's like this crazy invention. I was already starting from a pretty high level of knowledge. Another question generally had to do with, how Hydroviv was initially donating filters to people in Flint. And there were a lot of questions about whether we work with groups, whether we're continuing those charitable efforts. And the answer to that is yes. So one of the things really to understand is in the early days of Hydroviv, I didn't really have any support. So all the money that we being me, all the money that I raised really came from my bank account. Whereas now, which is obviously very limited, I'm not a wealthy man. But now what we do is we work with activists and other organizations to raise money to provide water filters to people in low-income areas. And the role that Hydroviv plays in this is we handle all the logistics and supply chain, and we also don't earn profit on sales on water filters that we donate to those communities. Kind of the agreement that we have with our charitable partners is they cannot sell the filters. They need to donate them to people in need. And then what we do is we do it at our cost. So the materials and stuff, we don't upcharge for any of that stuff. And we're able to use our supply chain and logistics to do so at a very, very efficient pace. So yeah, we continue those efforts, and those efforts are actually much, much larger now than they ever were in Flint. I mean, I think in 2020, we're on track to donate about $1 million worth of product to low-income families across the United States. So we're very proud of that. A lot of questions about Shark Tank. So a lot of them had to do with the actual Shark Tank negotiation. So one of them, when you're on Shark Tank, would you have been willing to walk away if the offer was to take more than 20% of the company? So just so everyone knows, so on Shark Tank, we filmed that, and on TV, I made a deal with Mark Cuban to get for him to invest $400,000 for 20% of the equity of the company. When you're preparing for Shark Tank, what they coach you on is they tell you to really make sure that you're willing to take the deal that you make on TV. And I definitely was. The number that I had in my head was 25%. Excuse me. When Mark Cuban, so I wouldn't have gone above 25%. But one of the things just to really understand is when you're in the tank, a lot of your planning kind of goes out the window just because it's a very stressful and dynamic situation. So I like to say I would have walked away at 25%, but who knows? Unfortunately, it didn't come to that. Got a lot of other questions about how it is to work with Mark Cuban. He's a celebrity, he has a very high profile. So one of the and we got asked a lot, is Shark Tank scripted? Now I'll address that first. The show's not scripted. The only part that's actually scripted is the first 60 to 90 seconds of a pitch, where the entrepreneur is actually going out there introducing their product. That part has been scripted, but the Q&A is not scripted at all. From what I understand, the sharks, before the entrepreneur walks out, they're handed a card with how to pronounce the entrepreneur's name and how to pronounce the company, and that's it. So the sharks literally know nothing about your business before you get out there. So the pitch itself lasts about an hour long. They edit it down to about 8 minutes on TV. And then after you make a deal, if you make a deal on the show, you go through what's called due diligence, which is really when the work begins and you start to really understand. It's not like you walk off stage and they hand you a duffel bag with 400 grand in it. That's just not how it works. During that due diligence period, that's when you really get to know the people that you'll be working with after the fact and make sure that your vision for the business aligns with what they would want to do. And in the case of Hydroviv, those visions were pretty different, so we didn't end up closing the deal with Mark. So Mark Cuban is not involved with Hydroviv anymore. We wish him well. We wish him the best. His team wished us the best. It wasn't a great fit for what we were trying to do. Okay, so those are kind of the Shark Tank questions. The next set of questions have to do with entrepreneurship in general. So now we're getting a little bit more broad and talking about entrepreneurship. And I got a lot of questions about people who are like, how to come up with pragmatic scientific solutions to major issues in an entrepreneurial context. It's hard. It's really, really hard to come up with ideas. Ideas also come to people in different ways. I know that one of my old colleagues, his ideas always came to him in the shower. For me, they always come on walks. So like I go for a long walk every night, and that's kind of where I think about ideas and really kind of clear my head and things like that. And basically the way that I do it is like, okay, here's a problem. Do I have a way to fix it? And then if there's some feasibility, what I'll do is I'll kind of start researching deeper and maybe try a prototype and things like that. I'm quite disciplined and pragmatic with product development, and that's just kind of how I handle it. What are the biggest challenges or things that try and take down your progress, if any? This is an excellent question. So one of the things to really understand, if you're looking to be an entrepreneur, whether it's social or whatever it is, you need to be prepared for haters. It happens. There are people that will try to tear you down every step along the way. For example, the first one that really happened at Hydroviv was we were actually accused with no facts from a contributor on Rachel Maddow's show about being a fraudulent company. They did no research. They did not call me. They didn't even Google my name. They just said Hydroviv is fraudulent, Filters for Front is fraudulent, and that got retweeted. And that was a problem for us. Fortunately, a couple days later, there was a Chicago Tribune article that came out and kind of validated us in what we were doing. So you need to be really, really prepared to deal with people that may not have great information, that are making really, really big accusations and trying to tear you down when you're small. As you grow, that becomes even bigger. You get a bigger target on your back, you have competition, and companies don't take lightly to people kind of like stealing market share for people. So it is highly, highly competitive. I would say just be ready to defend every single action that you take. It's something that will come up, especially if you're working in a highly technical field like science. Got a lot of questions about the role of entrepreneurship in social causes. So in general, I think that entrepreneurship is actually I think entrepreneurs are pretty well suited to address social causes because an entrepreneur gets to really dictate the path of their company. Whereas if you're working at a larger company, you may not have that same agency. I know that, I am, the CEO, I'm the owner of Hydroviv. So if we wanted to change direction, that would be my decision. I don't need to run it by a boss. I think that type of flexibility enables entrepreneurs to make a quicker impact than maybe some of the larger companies do, because you don't need to run it up the flagpole and up your chain of command to get sign off. You actually get to make that decision. There's downsides to it as well, because you also don't have the type of funding that a large company often has. So you have to be creative and figure out how to, build your company with very little. I mean, that's the thing about entrepreneurship that I don't think a lot of people understand is, the magic that takes place with no resources. So yeah, I would just say use the advantages of entrepreneurship to be nimble and attack very, very specific things, even if there's not a giant market for it. It could be a good thing. So one of the questions that people ask, I guess this could have gone in my history as well. So it's like, but I put it in the entrepreneur section because it's generally about what learnings have I found from my previous lives in academia and working for other companies that's been helpful in the current phase that we're at now. I would say, I mean, just so everyone kind of understands, I'm 38 now, so I'm quite a bit older than I think maybe a lot of startup founders are. But I've also been able to take a lot of experience away from a lot of the companies that I've worked from. I've had bosses, I've had good bosses, I've had bad bosses. Try to learn from the good ones, and I try to emulate the good ones and learn from what I didn't like about some of the other ones. You just learn how to run teams. There's a lot that you can learn by having a job. It's just, how to manage money, how to manage a budget, things like that. Those are all things that if I didn't know how to do when I started Hydroviv, like the company would be belly up by now. Like if I would have started this company when I was 22 years old, fresh out of college, it would not exist anymore. In academia, I was kind of fortunate in academia because I actually had an advisor that came from industry. So he actually came from Xerox. Back in the 90s. So I actually was very fortunate to have an advisor that understood entrepreneurship. He was actually the president, of the first company that I worked for as well. So, that blend, for me, that blend of R&D and also a business sense was very, very valuable for me, particularly for this current project, Hydroviv. Got a lot of questions about activism, ethics, misinformation, and things like that. So I've kind of condensed them down to really 3 categories of questions. So the first one is generally, what advice would I have as you all work on your degrees so you can figure out how to make the biggest impact? The best advice I would give people is to figure out what role you actually want to play in change. I don't care what any of the inspirational influencers out there that say you can do everything. It's not true. You cannot both be a domain expert on something and be a generalist at the same time, like when you're early on in your career. I would figure out what part of the solution you'd like to be a part of. If you want to be in activism, that's a great thing to do. That's raising awareness. If you want to actually be in the lab doing science, that's a much slower process. It's a very tedious process. It can be incredibly rewarding, but you just want to make sure that that's what you want to sign up for. And then if you want to be on the policy side, that's even slower. So, I mean, activism tends to be very, very fast. You can really very quickly organize something, and you can do that. Oftentimes the policy trails activism, and that can take a very, very long time. But science in general is really, really, really slow. So I would just say sample, do internships, get part-time jobs, whatever it is, volunteer, and just really kind of dial in what you want to work on. So when you're creating and designing kind of your educational program, you're actually leaving school armed with the tools that are going to help you get to where you actually want to be, not where you think you might want to be. That's the biggest advice I'd give. Another question had to do with ethics and kind of misinformation. So it's like, given the state around misinformation and generally science skepticism, what would you recommend? So I guess this is a really, really complicated question that you could talk for hours about. I would say in general, scientists don't necessarily do a great job explaining the limitations of what's known. I guess taking a step back, what I would say is whenever you're trying to earn trust with the public, like, you actually need to persuade people, okay? If you want your information to kind of land with your intended audience, it has nothing to do with the science that you've done. It's 100% communication, okay? So right now with skepticism, I think some of the skepticism is actually warranted. There's a great deal of fraud that takes place in science, and we need to be honest about that as scientists. I mean, just last year there was, $100 million settlement from Duke University, where they had like a research program that got hundreds of millions of dollars of government funding based off fraudulent data. And the scientists literally just fabricated data, and they got a lot of money for it. That's something, the scientific community largely has said, well, that's just a couple bad apples or bad actors. I think it's a bigger problem than that. So Nature, arguably the most reputable journal out there, peer-reviewed journal out there, they actually started to look at what's called in science the reproducibility crisis. And they found that 70% of scientists and researchers have tried reproducing someone else's data, and they weren't able to get the same results as that person. Now, that doesn't mean that science is broken, but it does mean that maybe the scientific process of peer review and publication could undergo some changes. And I think while we're doing that, it's really important that scientists really do a good job explaining to the public what's known and what's not known. One of the things that drives me crazy is you look at media publications, CNN or whatever, just being like, science says this or study says this. And it's really, really important that the public understands that about 80 to 90% of the new studies that come out will ultimately be disproven or seriously amended. So like those first publications that come out, the scientific process is to get those data out so other people can challenge them and things like that. And I would argue that in science, maybe we try too hard to make a splash with some of those data, when I think that it would be better to let the science actually become stronger before we start communicating those things, or at the very least, be very upfront about the limitations of the work that we're doing. And the reason why I raise all of that is because if you're a scientist and you're going out there saying, this is the case, and you're telling the public, this is the case, this is the case, this is the case, and then the science changes in 3 months, and you weren't upfront about it about the data being preliminary, there's a bit of a problem there, and you've lost some of that trust. As scientists, we can't both say, you must believe us because we're the authority, but then backpedal from our words when the data change. I think we need to be more humble than that, and we need to listen more and answer more of the questions from the public rather than just saying something as if it's concrete fact. Now, specifically, there was a lot of questions about environmental issues like climate change and things like that. And it's really important to understand that climate is different than that, because what we're talking about are decades of research. So I think what we need to do right now as scientists and earth scientists and environmental scientists is just answer questions that the public has. Because the way that you combat misinformation is just it's a slow process. We found, there's actually been social science that's found that misinformation is spread much faster than real information. The reason why is because misinformation tends to be more salacious than the actual truth. I think we just need to answer questions. Just be like, hey, this is why we believe this is the case. And, just explain that science, maybe some of the words from 10 years ago that the deniers are using to disprove the entire thing, they're pretty minor in the scheme of things. And then you can help them understand what the data actually say. I think that, earning trust is really, really hard. And I don't think we should act as if we're entitled to trust. I think we need to continually earn trust from the public. A lot of times what we work on is really quite complicated, so we can't just shout at people to believe us. So that's kind of my take on it. So I think it's important to kind of slow down, communicate. And I guess the final question, this is another one that could have gone in the entrepreneurship section, but generally a lot of questions about what y'all should be doing, what other topics that you can tackle, what other companies are tackling things. And I guess, and what advice would I give for how you should move forward on it? What I would really, really recommend is figuring out what it is that excites you and then kind of work from there. The reason why I say that is, again, it goes back to something earlier that I talked about how science can be very tedious and slow. So if all you're living for is like that big announcement and that big discovery at the end, I think you might find that that's not, you'll burn out very quickly. What I would really recommend is falling in love with a topic so you fall in love with the actual path to get to that point. For example, specifically about some companies that are doing some really great work in the water space, if something that is very important to you is water conservation, there's a really great company out of Denver called Ratio that focuses entirely on water conservation and how you can reduce water use in the home. There's several other companies like Moen, just like the giant company Moen, they have a flow meter that helps people reduce water waste as well. A lot of companies working on that type of stuff. If you're interested in water quality, on the treatment side, there's companies like Hydroviv. Obviously, I'm biased. I think we do really great work there. If you're interested on the municipal kind of policy side of stuff, there's all like the environmental nonprofits and things like that. So NRDC, EDF, places like that, they're the ones that are really advocating for policy changes. And then there's also a lot of grassroots organizations that focus in the local community. So like, those are all places for you to go. So again, what I would do is I would really just spend the time that you have now, do a little bit of work to figure out what you like. It's better to spend a year figuring out what you like, so the next 30 years you're working on something that you enjoy, rather than just like jumping in, getting a degree, spending a ton of money, and then only to learn at the other end of it that you actually don't like doing, whatever it is that you studied. So those are the questions that I had. Again, I apologize. We had so many questions that I had to kind of lump stuff together. But again, if you have any questions, any specific follow-ups, just reach out to me either on LinkedIn or Instagram. Again, my Instagram handle is @Hydroviv_Eric. And yeah, that's probably the best way to get in touch with me. So I want to thank you all for your time, and have a great afternoon or whatever time of the day it is that you're actually watching this. Take care.